Welcome to Behind the Build. I'm your host, Jonathan Jacobs. And today's guest, I have Elsa Lam from Canadian Architect. Elsa is the editor-in-chief of the magazine and has been there for how many years now?
12 years now.
12 years. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I had heard Elsa's name so many times from various people within this industry, architects, and you have such a strong reputation doing what you do, covering architecture across the country. So upon hearing your name so many times and then reviewing some of the articles that you had written about what had happened with the Science Center, I said to myself, you know what, I need to have her on. Why? Why is because this is generally with architects, interior designers that I have on the podcast, but given your role and your connectivity to what architecture is nationally, who better to speak to than someone that has been able to see it for as long as you have, with the eye that you have and the brain that you have.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much.
So again, conversational style of podcast. Elsa does a very good job of being able to do research. Her articles are very well put together, from being able to distill down complicated information into something that the layman can understand, which is really a gift in writing, because most people are not always able to do that. It requires a lot more thought. Sometimes people have to research words to understand them better. And what I have found in reading your work is that that's not the case. You are able to take complicated information and distill it down into a way that pretty much anyone can read it and understand.
Yeah, well, clarity is everything for me. I mean, I'm really focused on clarity, and exactly what you said, distilling complexity into clear texts.
Yeah. So let's talk about how that started with you. School. How did it all begin? Did you know that you wanted to become a journalist? Did you not? Was this something you knew early on in your life?
No. So I went to architecture school at the University of Waterloo.
Yeah.
And 4 years into that process, I had gravitated towards the cultural history stream of courses, which was more the kind of big ideas and, how do buildings fit into what's happening in a broader cultural lens. So I had done a couple of co-op terms as well, and between those two
in Rome, right?
We did a study abroad program in Rome, and as part of the Waterloo program, they've had a really long established co-op component to education, university wide, including in architecture. Yeah. So I had done some co-op internships at the Children's Hospital in Ottawa as part of their kind of in-house architecture department. Where else did I do some? In various places here, in some firms here in Toronto. And through that, I started feeling like maybe going into architecture professionally wasn't quite the right path for me. I was super drawn to the ideas and to thinking about architecture, and a bit less to the actual work of architectural practice. So I pivoted. I did a master's in architectural history and theory at McGill with Alberto Perez Gomez. And then following that, I did my PhD in architectural history and theory at Columbia University with Ken Frampton and others at Columbia University.
Amazing. So, that's a pretty broad spectrum of areas to study, both between Waterloo, which is now booming. I know that when you were there, it was different, but what's happening in Waterloo right now is incredible. For those that don't know, Waterloo is about an hour and 10 minutes west of Toronto. It was where BlackBerry was founded, among other incredible institutions. So there's that. And Montreal, and incredible, and New York. And one of the things I actually saw when you were studying at McGill, so you wrote a paper on trying to clean what it would look like to clean the river. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, we did a kind of a master's thesis that was kind of like a bit of it was pretty broad in what we could tackle there. So I took a kind of creative take on cleaning the Lachine Canal and, proposing a series of structures that would deal with treating the water from the Lachine Canal. It was kind of a bit of a fantastical proposal. And it was a chance to experiment almost in making a bit of a graphic novel, actually, about this kind of, fundamentally this tension between the natural world and the constructed world.
Right.
And then the lengths to which we have to go to try to correct that relationship.
It's interesting too, is that timely, given what just happened in Paris. And,
yes.
And their attempt to try to clean the river.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
When I saw that detail, I was like, wow, she was ahead of her time.
Yeah.
and so okay, so from McGill you went to New York and you studied at Columbia. And so what did you find were some of the great takeaways that you, and I know this is a broad question, but some of the great takeaways you had from each of those schools, were there one or two or three different really like core elements that you've worked on implementing in you and yourself as a professional now?
Yeah, it was three great components to an education. And it followed an interesting kind of almost time trajectory in that Waterloo at the time, the director was Rick Haldenby. He's still active at the school, though he's kind of stepping away a little bit and doing more of his own research as he kind of edges towards retirement, maybe. And he had a real passion for ancient Greece and Rome. And, we were reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. We were trying to understand really the very fundamental ideas of, who were the first architects? What were the first ideas about architecture? How did this idea originate in the Western world largely? And then at McGill, Belta Perez Gomez, who's leading that program, was really interested in the pre-modern world. So kind of up to kind of the early, say the 1750s or so. So very interested in how cultures over the Renaissance and medieval periods looked at space in different ways, how the idea of space was intertwined with ideas of what is sacred in the world in a much deeper way now, and then how that changed as we moved towards a modern world where things became much more about what could be measured, what was empirically kind of provable, and how you could eventually, how you could factory produce things eventually. So architecture kind of went from being something that was very intertwined with, say, spiritual systems and deeper systems of thinking about the world to something that's much more commoditized and much more of a product. So he was interested in documenting that shift and following how that shift happened. Mm-hmm. And then at Columbia, the focus, with Ken Frampton and Mary McLeod and others was really on the modern and contemporary world. So in a way, I kind of had a complete education through all three of these, though I didn't realize that I was piecing it together like that at the time.
And pretty much taking off from where one ended.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. Yeah.
Interesting. And so when you were at Columbia, was there any form of a co-op there or no?
No.
Nothing.
I mean, there was a little bit of a co-op in that as a grad student, you're expected to play a role in teaching undergrads.
Okay.
So as a research assistant for Ken Frampton in his kind of Architecture 101 classes for the undergrads in the architecture school. So I got a little bit of taste of teaching there.
Okay. And where was it that you landed your first role as a journalist?
So when I was applying for PhD programs, I'd always been interested in writing and in magazines. So I thought, well, maybe I'll make a go at this. So I started to research how to put together a pitch. And I pitched to the then editor of Canadian Architect, Ian Chodikoff, and said, I'd really like to write something for Canadian Architect. How would I do that? And he said, well, you're based in Montreal. Why don't you write about kitsch in Quebec? So just throwing something out there. And I decided to take that on. I spent a lot of time writing 700 words and traveling all over Montreal, looking at some buildings in Hull as well, kind of just looking everywhere to try to figure out how to flesh this out. And that was really the first article that I published. And since that time, I also built out a couple of clients. I started to write a column for Azura magazine on new materials. And I was also writing for some firms, doing some of their PR writing.
Okay. And how are you sourcing that work for the firms? Like they had put out calls on this?
Well, it's funny that, you kind of have to find your champions in a way. And a lot of this is luck and good fortune. So that first article that I wrote for Ian Chodikoff about kitsch in Quebec architecture, one of the projects that I featured on it was Claude Cormier's lipstick forest, these pink tree-like columns in the Palais des Congrès in Montreal. And I looked up Claude Cormier's office, and it happened to be in his house that was down the street from where I was living in the Plateau of Montreal at that time.
Amazing.
So I went and knocked on his door, and I said, well, I don't know what to do with this, but I wrote this, magazine article. You're in it. And Claude answered the door. He said, great, we need a writer. Can you help us with this proposal? And so... yeah,
literally opportunity knocking on the door.
Yes. Or I knocked and opportunity answered.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful for, that Claude was such a early champion and was so encouraging, basically and Ian Chodikoff also, of somebody who was just getting their toes wet in architecture writing at that time.
Yeah. So you go and you start writing for Claude, right?
Yep.
And from there, you are able to then acquire some additional work because now you have that as a part of your portfolio.
Yeah, things build on each other, and you kind of take, and writing for Canadian Architect, I kind of wrote one article a year, basically, for Canadian Architect over the course of a decade.
Yeah.
I picked up some freelance writing based on another one of those articles when I was in New York City. So I'd written a piece about Office for Visual Interaction, which is a lighting designer in New York City, super talented. And after I wrote that article, I knocked on their door and ended up doing some freelance writing for their office as well. So by the time I graduated from Columbia University, I had half a decade or so of writing under my belt.
Amazing.
And then when Ian Chodikoff was finished with his time as editor, I applied for that job. And, and I had a substantial writing portfolio at that point.
And who is doing the review of your work for that position at the time? Is it Ian that you're applying to?
Yeah, it was Ian as well as the publishers and other people. I'm sure I wasn't the only person that interviewed for that job.
No, I know. That's why I'm asking. I'm like, who's the panel that gets to make the decision?
Right. It's a small company, so so Ian, the publisher at the time, there would have been a couple of other people that were making that decision.
Amazing.
But it was, you build relationships as you go, and
yeah.
I tend to, probably like you, I tend to like people. I tend to think the best of people and get along, well with people.
Yeah.
So you just kind of cultivate positive relationships as you go. And then, at some point, those things, that network starts to feed back to you. If you're lucky, so, and I do consider myself to be lucky and privileged in all of this.
I would say, 12 years later, you're involved in I guess this is my own opinion of it, but a very, very important way. You're now looking at covering some of the biggest issues that are happening here in the city and across the country. And as I say it, I will get to watch you smile because it's such an important element of what we as Canadians get to experience.
Yeah,
it really is. It's a built environment, and what's happening from a commercial, institutional, from government planning perspective to these installations that get installed in parks. Like, this is how we get to experience the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I feel like I'm in an incredibly lucky position to have an overview of so many things that are going on. It takes, like in any job, it takes a few years just to figure out how to do your job.
Yes.
But then after that, there's a certain amount of latitude and you can start to shape things. So I've really tried to shape things at the magazine in a way that reflects both what's going on in the industry, but also that reflects, my values and some of the values that I see coming forward in the industry. And, how do you support the positive things that are going on? How do you create resources that architects, it's largely a readership for architects, that architects that read this magazine can use and use towards advancing their own practices. So how do you share all of those, the best kind of practices that are going on?
And what have you found once you really got your feet set? What did you find that you really lean towards in terms of coverage? Are there specific areas that you really wanted to lean into?
Yeah, sustainability, number one. We're in the middle of a climate crisis. I think that discourse has been evolving so quickly in the architecture world. 10-15 years ago, nobody even really knew what LEED was. And now it's just and if you look at a jurisdiction like Vancouver, you have to build everything to Passive House standard.
Yeah.
I mean, so things have evolved very quickly. The standards and just the baseline of what you're expected to do as an architect, or just in the building industry in general, has come forward immensely. Now we're talking about upfront carbon or embodied carbon. So there's a lot of new things, but these are also opportunities for architects to be making an impact with what they're doing and contributing towards building a future that's immensely more sustainable than what we have now. I mean, buildings are 40% of the carbon footprint globally in terms of the energy used to make those buildings and operate them. So it's a huge, huge chunk. I mean, more so than transportation even.
And what do you see as one of the core competencies in being able to really improve upon the sustainable elements of design and architecture?
The big conversation right now is about upfront carbon.
Okay.
I'm using Lloyd Alter's term, which I think is a bit more accurate than embodied carbon. But basically the carbon that goes into materials. And I think that the discourse right now is really evolving towards the first choice being to avoid demolishing buildings. So the first choice being renovation or adaptive reuse. Yeah. We know in the States, 50% of projects, of construction projects in the States are adaptive reuse, renovation, additions, are all in this sector. So it's also a really growing part of the market as well. So, so architects have to learn to be good at this. We're talking in schools now about should this be part of school curriculums?
Right.
Students have to learn how to do adaptive reuse. They can't just be learning how to design something on a carte blanche on a blank slate kind of site. So that I think is maybe one of the more important core competencies involved with this.
That's a very interesting topic. Is there a panel that exists, or a group that exists of the program writers for all of the schools in the country where they come together and talk about something like that?
Yeah, there is a panel that's a grouping of all the schools.
Yeah.
That forms kind of the guidelines for what it takes for the school programs to be certified, and then in turn what it takes to be licensed as an architect coming out of those programs.
Is it this panel that would then want to look at putting something like that forward in terms of establishing an element of the curriculum?
I understand that it's something that's being discussed. Yeah. I don't really know what stage that discussion is at, but I understand that it's being discussed.
Because that is very interesting, because now you're talking about being able to bring architects out of school in a way their mind is set that they're not just going to go and design something to be torn down and rebuilt. The purposeful built renovation. I walked you through my house. It's renovation. You can't tear down a semi, but renovations are so vital to maintaining some form of the heritage of what the home was.
Absolutely. And then you're also not, throwing all of that upfront carbon that's in the structure of your house and in your foundation into the garbage.
Yeah.
So, and from what I've seen, regardless of whether this is officially on the school curriculums or not, it's certainly something that a lot of instructors in architecture schools and professors are tackling in their studios. And I think that architecture school has also changed a lot from when I was in architecture school now 25 years ago. Yeah. It's much less about, a kind of competitive environment where all of the students are trying to outdo each other. And it's much more of a collaborative environment where people are trying to work together. Mm-hmm. Students are really interested in all of these big questions about sustainability, about, social equity. And they're trying to get their heads around that and figure out how they can make a difference with the skills that they're acquiring in school.
Interesting. So I know that there are a lot of advocacy groups that exist, both here in Toronto and abroad. When I say abroad, I mean, kind of across the country. What types of groups are you involved with that relate to architecture?
So I'm involved in a group called BEAT, Building Equality in Architecture Toronto, which is involved in another kind of area of interest for me, which is about equity in architecture. And in this group particular, the focus is that kind of core group of women in architecture and trying to increase opportunities for women in architecture. But this whole question of equity, whether it's in the profession itself or how buildings serve the people that they're meant to serve, is a really interesting field for me, and the kind of things that I want to cover in the magazine as well.
And so can you go a little bit more into what that would look like? What are some of the I guess the deeper topics related to like the built environment for how it's going to be more equal?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so there's
it's a loose question. I'm trying to like formulate that question in my mind.
And we'll make it more concrete. I mean, there's a lot of kind of subparts to it. I mean, the most obvious one could be about accessibility, for instance.
Okay.
So, and that's accessibility for, going off women in architecture, talking about kids and families, for instance. So when we design like, a wheelchair ramp, right? You think, oh, like, are people going to use this? Is this really important? Well, every parent with a kid under the age of 4 is going to be kissing a kid in a stroller and using that ramp. So it starts to increase the number of people that are using these things, right?
I'm like smiling as you're saying that, because I'm thinking about like when our kids were young, we used the stroller in those places that didn't have it.
Yeah,
and you have to like lift it up. It's
a huge pain. Or if the button isn't placed in the right place,
right,
and you're trying to like do this weird dance with your stroller to hit the door opener.
Yeah.
So I mean, these are things that as a parent, because you've been there. But if you're not a parent, you don't necessarily see that, right? So there's those kinds of things that are just built environment things that if you're a woman, you see different things that a man might see.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we could talk about, even something like, I don't know if you want to go there in your podcast, but like period equity, right? So,
why not? Why would I not want to go there?
1 in 4 of, most women are menstruating at any point in time. The federal government has recently put out a thing saying that all federal spaces, so all airports and, post offices, those things that are controlled by the federal government, have to have free menstrual products in their bathrooms. So, it's a small thing, but it is a built environment.
That is not a small thing. That is a big thing.
Yeah. So that starts to change. Like if that expands to other kinds of public spaces.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a basic human right, that you should have the things that you need.
Yes.
To deal with, the things that your body does.
I'm going to sound so naive in saying this, but like it's something that I would never think about because it's not a part of my genes.
Yeah. And we don't.
Right.
Yeah. So, but this is
what a great thing to be an advocate for.
So, so you think about that when we talk about diversity in the profession, why it's important to have, women in architecture offices, but kind of all kinds of diversity in architecture offices. Yeah. It's just having more different perspectives to see things from. So if you have an office that's made of, all white men of a certain age, it doesn't mean that it's a bad office, but it just means that they're kind of seeing things through a single lens. If you start to throw in some diversity, a couple of women, some people that are of different ethnic, backgrounds, of different socioeconomic backgrounds, then you start to have different lenses.
Yes.
To which, when you're just looking at a bathroom drawing, you can automatically see, oh, this isn't going to work for changing a kid in a diaper. And it's, if you haven't had a kid, then you just don't see that. You don't think about, where you change your kid's diaper. Yeah. But if you, if you have that expertise in your office or that life experience in your office, then you start to see those things, right? And there's lots of things that you and I don't see because we have lots of blind spots too.
I mean, you are literally taking a flashlight right now in my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about all of the things that I don't think about in architecture. And I say this because, what we do, we're building all of this at Walden, right? We're building these custom homes, and whether it's from the ground up or it's a renovation project, and you're looking through plans and you're analyzing them and the things that work and won't work. But there are so many elements of what you just discussed that when I look at plans, I'm never really fully contemplating those details.
Yeah, and it's like, and probably the architect teams that you work with as well, that you collaborate with. I mean, you want architect teams that have that breadth of expertise that can look at a plan of a custom home and say, okay, well, let's look 20 years down the future when there might be some aging parents, going on here. Like, how are we going to be able to accommodate somebody if they have a mobility issue, say, or, is there a way that we can design this so it's easy to, renovate if we want to be able to incorporate a granny suite for, for an aging set of parents in this house. Mm-hmm. Or if, if the kids are growing up and they might not be able to afford a house of their own? Is there a way that we can, think about in the future, how can we divide this house into two? And you can make a lot of upfront decisions, that look into the future and that enable those kinds of things to happen more easily in the future.
It's interesting because as you say that, I think about a lot of the cultures where there are multiple generations living within the home. And it's not in mine, but I see it in so many. And it's such a vital component to the existence and the prolonged life of those parties that are involved in this. When you're there to be able to help support and provide all the love to your family in a home that's multi-generational, they're going to live longer.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just, and hopefully you'll live. I mean, these things are never without friction, I'm sure.
Of course.
But hopefully everybody on the whole is happier with that arrangement. It's also very different, if you have a granny suite versus, a grandparent living in your spare bedroom too. So sometimes having a little bit of distance is really healthy for that relationship if you have the space that could afford that.
So your involvement in that, and that is like, equality and getting an understanding of all that it's amazing because you've actually just by having this conversation, you've broadened my spectrum of thought on what way I'm going to look at plans now and recommendations. But so from there, are there other advocacy programs or articles or anything that you're currently involved with?
Well, I've been quite involved with the Ontario Science Centre advocacy effort over the past 6 weeks or so since it closed. Maybe I'll be a full 2 months by the time this goes to air.
Probably a little bit more, but yeah.
I think probably, one of the first people with architecture eyes to really take a close look at the engineer's report that the government was citing as the basis for closing the building at the end of June this year. Mm-hmm. And, saying, wait a second, this is not what this report says. This report actually involves a kind of program of gradually addressing this issue and resolving it over many years. And it doesn't say that you have to close down the building. And all of these suspect roof panels are not actually over key exhibition areas when you look at the floor plans.
I will say that one of the methods of you and I ended up connecting was over the Science Center. So to go into this now is in some ways very exciting because I had read some of the stuff that you had put out initially, and it was referenced by some other people that I'd spoken with in the industry. So, and for anyone listening to this, I had previously recorded a podcast with Brian Rudy from
Moriyama Tashima.
Moriyama Tashima. Thank you. And Brian worked on debunking a lot of the details within the report, alongside some of the research that you had done, Elsa, in this, and that you have continued to put out. Because it didn't start with just one article. It didn't just end with the first article that you wrote. Yeah. Yeah. You've essentially done like multiple exposés on this.
Yeah. I mean, I've written, I guess, about half a dozen articles at this point, basically looking at the documents that the government is putting out and doing a deep dive into what those documents actually say from an architectural perspective.
Yeah.
And then comparing that with the kind of what the government is saying to the press, which is often quite a different spin from what their consultant reports say.
Right. And for anyone, again, listening to this, I'm sure not all of us are taking the time to go and break down what the reports are that the government has received, that they have to publish and put available to all of us online. But you're doing that. And I know that you two had told me over lunch that you'd released a piece, was it last night?
Yeah.
Which will now be probably weeks later that this goes to air, but nonetheless, you'd released that. But then, was it 2 weeks ago that you released another article that broke down all the individual elements of, it was about HVAC, it was about where the panels are, what the issues with the panels were.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll go through, I'll kind of give it like the one-line synopsis of each of these articles. Sure. So the first article it's been interesting because they become a resource for the general press as well. So I've done a number of news spots on this. That first week after the Science Center closed was nutty, but in a good way. I mean, I was glad to be able to be an expert face on this issue and to speak to something that is just, such a clear kind of unfolding catastrophe in my mind, that if there's any way to slow this down or stop it, I feel like I need to be doing that.
Yeah.
So the first article I put out was about the roof report. And how that, as I described to you, the government's take that the roof report justified the closure was entirely a misinterpretation of that report. A second article I did was about the RFP for a temporary science center space. So I started speaking to some industry experts in commercial real estate in different places to understand what the cost of that temporary space would actually look like. And it's significant. It's, it's in the tens of millions of dollars to have a temporary space for a couple of years.
Right.
Once you fit it out. And it also won't be open until 2026. So a full 2 years from now.
Yeah.
So that's 2 years with no science center at all.
Right.
I did another piece that was about, at some point the government put out, they said, well, no, it's not just the roof. Everything in this building is falling apart. Doug Ford said, you're going to fall off your chair when you see the latest documents that we have. So I took a look at those documents.
While falling off your chair.
I did not fall off my chair. I don't know if you fell off your chair.
No.
But, basically they had pulled together a PowerPoint identifying some other issues and reissued a building condition assessment that they had from years ago. So I looked at that and, also debunked that. It's really a number of very minor issues that they were pointing to. Some of those things we talked over lunch about, they had some kind of mysterious malfunction with a HVAC pipe. So it could be, I talked to a mechanical engineer who said, well, this is, who knows what a mysterious malfunction is, but it sounds like it's a leak or a clog. And both of those things can be quite easily resolved. Those are things that happen in our own homes. Yeah. They're easily resolved.
Yeah. Like, could you, just on that topic alone, I don't mean to break up your flow, but just you have to appreciate this if you're listening. Imagine that someone said to you that one of the ducts inside of your home was clogged, and as a result of that, you need to vacate your home and condemn it.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, right? None of this stands to reason. And I think that the government has felt that by saying that something is a public safety issue, and that gives them kind of a broad scope to close a building entirely. Yeah. But I think that this is fallacious. When you look at the actual reports, it does not seem that there is a public safety issue here that could not be resolved in other ways. Mm-hmm. So, the duct thing. There was another couple of things in that PowerPoint. Yeah. They were talking about how to inspect the parts of the roof that hadn't been inspected, you would need to do a lot of destruction to the ceilings. It would be really invasive. But then when you actually look at the roof report, it offers all their alternatives. It says one of those sections, you could actually walk into that section of roof. It's a big building. So those, that plenum is quite large. So you could actually walk into it. It wasn't accessible at the time that they were there, but it sounds like that would be available. Right. And then another part, they said you could put a drone in it if you wanted to take a closer look. So these are clearly things where you could drill a small hole and put a drone in there, or you wouldn't have to take down the whole roof. Yep. So there's a number of things that just don't really stand up to reason that they were putting forward as major issues. They've also said that it's going to cost $500 million to repair the Science Center. Again, this doesn't seem to pass a sniff test. This is approaching $1,000 a square foot in repair costs, which, as you pointed out, is the cost of building like a luxury home with a new build with very high-end finishes. It's
high-end everything.
Everything.
Yeah. Like you're picking very nice details to be able to go and spend those kind of dollars. Yeah.
So this is not the cost of repairing the Science Center. If you look at their own reports from before that they're drawing from, the cost that their consultants quoted is $228 million. And that includes a bunch of things that the government had said would be extra on top of it. But that $228 million includes $32 million to replace all of the roofs, over $10 million to replace all of the HVAC systems. It includes $25 million in interior finishes and so on. So,
and you were saying that wasn't there a double up of one of those?
Yeah. So they double counted some of those. So, the government has taken, and it also includes a 185% markup factor for consultants and complexity, which people in the industry will know is a very large markup factor to account for these things. So, the way that the government reached the $500 million figure that it's been now citing is they took that $228 million. They added the cost of inflation over 20 years, since nothing, things don't need to be done all at once. Mm-hmm. They added a 40% markup on top of that as cost contingency. And then they threw in another $109 million for to upgrade the exhibitions and do interior upgrades as well. So that interior upgrades portion has been double counted, since that was, there's a substantial figure towards interior upgrades in that initial quote. And that exhibition cost, they're saying they're going to spend $66 million on exhibitions, which is the cost for entirely new exhibitions at Ontario Place, which is where they're proposing to move the Science Centre into a half-size facility.
Right.
So the work that I've been doing, the article that I just put out has been about a single page in their business case for relocating Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. It's a single page that lays out the scenario of decanting to an alternate space, as they put it, which is essentially what they're proposing now of moving to a temporary science centre. Mm-hmm. And it does detail that this will cost tens of millions of dollars. And I think that they also underestimate that a little bit, because they're counting on, they're saying, there's a column that says pros of doing this and another cons column. So they say that as a pro, they're going to be able to reduce the programming and operational costs to the tune of $13 to $14 million a year. So that's a lot less science programming. That's a third of the Science Centre's budget. So I don't know how this can be a pro. I guess maybe from a financial perspective, this is a pro, but to remove, a substantial amount of science programming, which is the core mission of the Science Centre. 100%. And what we're trying to, the reason we have science centers and we're trying to educate the next generation of kids in STEM and get them excited about it.
Yeah.
So I don't, in my mind, I can't really understand how this is a pro. They also say as a pro that they're going to have substantial staffing reductions resulting in surplusing. That means firing people, right? That means laying people off.
Yeah, so, we're going to increase unemployment in Ontario.
I know. So, so this is, yeah. So it's clearly there's some things that are wrong, lots of things that are wrong about this temporary move. The other thing is that this new science centre at Ontario Place, if you look at the terms for their temporary space, the RFP that they put out for that space, they want that space until 2030 to 2034. So they're basically saying that a new science centre at Ontario Place won't be ready until possibly 10 years from now, which, from an industry standpoint, and where they're at in the P3 process, that's absolutely correct that, it will be 6 to 10 years from now until we get a new science centre at Ontario Place. But I don't, this is the reason I'm involved in this advocacy, because it doesn't seem justifiable that you would offer, Toronto, the GTA, Ontario's kids and families, a tenth of a size temporary science centre that won't be open for 2 years. And then eventually a half-sized science centre that won't be open for 10 years. This is, my kid is 7 right now. He's going to be going to university practically by the time this new science centre opens. And, that's one kid. It's a whole generation of kids that are going to miss out on this full science centre experience, which, you have kids, and you live close by to the science centre. So, what a treasure that is to have that place where it's, it's about science, but it's also super fun for kids. Like, it's also, it's like learning through play for them.
Oh, I had nostalgia. So when we moved into the Leaside area, I've always been active, and one of the things I got back into when we moved into this area was trail mountain biking. And there's a network of trails, literally right off of where we are now. It's almost 100K worth of trails in this network.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And one of the trails that leads you into, I don't know, probably 65 to 70K worth of trails takes you right past the bottom section of the Science Centre.
Neat.
And the first time that I rode that trail, I could not believe that I was right, because I never put the thought to where I was. But I was riding along this trail. I'm like, I cannot believe that that's the Science Centre right over there. Oh, this is so cool. And I had all this nostalgia on my bike in the bottom of the valley riding past the Science Centre. And now here I am thinking that again, in this area, not able on a rainy day to utilize our pass and take my kids over there to get the experience of watching their hair expand and stand.
Yeah.
And not be able to understand, oh my goodness, all of the different specialized programs that they offered.
Yeah.
The camps, the exhibits, the human body exhibit that was in there a couple of years ago, and how amazing that was. There was a mechanics exhibit that was in there where it was all these metals with levers, very much like an architectural
the dinosaur one. Yeah.
And it was so interesting to be able to watch my at the time my 4 or 5 year old pulling on a lever that could make this dinosaur move, and she was making a dinosaur move.
Yeah.
And the smile that she had over her face, and to think that the government is taking a stance on this that is so against the creation of these, I'm going to think of the word here, these imaginative minds.
Yeah.
And just squashing that opportunity.
I know. And, Brian Rudy on your podcast explained it so eloquently, how much the architecture is integral with that experience. I mean, and, that experience of going, across the bridge and down those escalators, you're descending from the treetops down to it's a huge treehouse. So that whole, experience and, and that whole connection that creates between nature and science. I mean, nature is at the root of science. But, that science is not something that happens on your computer screen. It's about understanding the natural world and what we learn from the natural world and how we are part of nature as well. And this is just absolutely essential education in our current world when we're dealing with climate crisis. And we're dealing with all of these things where the tension between the human world and the natural world has never been so fraught and so in need of scientific minds to bridge and heal that divide and to make those connections and reforge those connections in a way. So it's this tremendous loss, and even having that closed for 2 years is a huge loss.
It's brutal.
I mean, if you think of the life of a kid, and that's the time from now, this summer until this temporary science center will be open. Who knows where the temporary science center. If this temporary science center will be, I mean, they're asking for a space that's a tenth of the size of the science center. So it's going to be a shadow of the current science center.
Right.
And then, and to eventually have a science center that's half the size of this place at Ontario Place. I mean, it seems like a raw deal.
And it's so inaccessible.
Yes.
That's the other element of all of this, and I briefly touched on this with Brian, but you have to walk through the entire X grounds, right? If you're taking public transit to be able to get there.
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to go build the Ontario line and you can go walk from the exit of a subway.
Listen, I mean, when the Ontario government did its business case for relocating the Science Centre from its current location to Ontario Place, the Auditor General kind of did a thorough look at this relocation. And the Ontario government knew at the onset, from its preliminary studies, that this location would be more difficult for suburban families to access and for school groups to access. School groups make up 25% of the visitors to the Science Centre.
Right.
And so they didn't talk to those groups. They actually did not talk to any of the school boards. So the Auditor General's office did. And, they talked to 58 school boards in the region and did a big survey of teachers. And they found that, something like 47 or 49% of the people that they talked to said that, their students would have more difficulty getting to a science center that was downtown. I mean, you just don't have enough hours in the school day to bus your kids all the way downtown to navigate all the traffic downtown. Yeah. And then, and that's not even talking about the kind of experience that those kids would have. Whereas right now, if you think about the school spaces, those really lovely colored pods overlooking the ravine.
Yes.
They have all these spaces for specialized programs. They do like a Mars simulator, I think, at where they kind of, pretend that a classroom of kids is organizing a mission to Mars, and they walk them through all the different steps that would be involved with that.
Yeah.
They simply don't have the space for that in the new, this new science center that's being proposed on Ontario Place. They have some school spaces that are in the basement. They're on a parking level, so no natural light. I guess car fumes. Maybe they'll have some really great air filtration. But, underground spaces are the dedicated school spaces, and they don't have the kind of classroom spaces. Their dedicated educational spaces are basically nothing in the new science center.
I'm going to say this, and I'm saying this. It is also very challenging throughout all of these conditions that the general architecture community may think something about all of this, but they also have to be very careful, and a lot of them won't voice their opinions because Infrastructure Ontario is such a large entity. They don't want to lose the opportunity to be able to work on some of the new and upcoming projects, even though I would say probably 95% or more might not agree with what the decision has been made on the current science center, in addition to where the new science center is going to go, in addition to where the interim science center might be. Like, it is such a disgusting thing to have done.
Yeah.
And the industry's upset with it, but people have to stay quiet in some way about it. Yeah. So it's really nice to have an advocate like you doing what many people feel they can't.
Yes, and I don't think anybody's asking people to put their businesses or livelihoods at risk over this. So I feel really privileged in a way, obligated to do this work because I'm in a position where I can speak about these things, and I can speak with authority since I edit a national architecture magazine, Canadian Architect. I know that the Toronto Society of Architects and Azure Magazine has also been, they've also been doing work speaking out about this. Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad that I can contribute to that.
Yeah. No one has asked you to do it, but I can tell you that from the people that I've spoken to, everyone's really happy that you are doing it.
It's been a lot of work, I won't lie.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And there's been a couple of nights where, my husband has been very tolerant of me, talking his ear off about Science Center. And there's been a couple of nights where I've woken up in the middle of the night and been like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this thing, this aspect of it. But I'm also immensely grateful that I can play this role. And I think at any point in your career, when you're looking for things to put your energy towards that are things of your own choosing, that are outside of your job scope, then you have to say, well, where can I make the most impact with what I have, with the connections that I've made, with the position that I have, with all the various privileges that you happen to have, mm-hmm. And I think that this is unequivocally where I could be making a lot of impact right now. So I'm glad that I'm in the position to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I admire you for it. We talked about how, when I was younger and I'd studied in school, that I was being pushed into doing a lot of things that I didn't want to do. And stories were taken into an angle that I didn't want. And I again, never really thought that I'd be in the construction industry and all of a sudden starting a podcast and talking about all these things and really social matters that we're discussing now. It's such an important thing to be able to do and to utilize all of the network that you have. I will say, from my own standpoint, rather than speak for others, that having read through what you've put out on all of this, and I say all of this related to the Science Center, it is powerful. It is really, really powerful. And I will say, I feel like you speak for me because I grew up in the city. I grew up not far from where we are now. I have been going to that institution my entire life, whether it was for my own educational purposes, or I was biking past it, or I was then taking my kids to it. It has been a part of my life for the better part of almost 40 years. And one of the most interesting things that I found out after doing the podcast with Brian, turns out that one of my classmates from elementary school, who I'm still in contact with, it was his uncle who designed it.
Oh, neat.
And I said, I looked at the last name, Moriyama. And I text my friend Sky, and I said, Sky, is he your uncle? He writes back to me, he says, yeah. I said, you should listen to the podcast he just put out about what he designed. Because it's all full circle. In some way or another, almost anything that you do in your life, if you open your eyes to it, and a lot of people don't want to do that. They want to walk with the horse blinders on, like they're running in a race. But if you open your eyes up and you look around, you'll see that there's so much that you do that you started with in one place to where you are now that has been circular in some way. And you've talked about that and how your career has taken shape and knocking on a door, leading to opportunity, and from Waterloo to now, and how everything that you've done has really been a pretty incredible journey to date so far.
It's been a great journey.
It has. And look, and getting to know you has been amazing. I appreciate you taking the time. I know that you have been very busy doing all your research and putting together publication. And I know that you're on the phone all the time and you're on email all the time. I know that you also very, very much value family time. So thank you for taking the time to go over all of this with me. I feel like I'm going to need to have you back on to discuss other important details of the architecture community across the country. So we'll have to schedule that for another time. Thank you again, Elsa, for everything today.
Thanks so much for having me.